Hey, I'm starting a new organization called the False Advertising Spot and Terminate, or FAST. Yeah, false advertising spot and stop was already taken, so I had to improvise. Anyways, the goal of this group is to find false advertising and stop it in its tracks. I'm primarily targeting the gaming industry in particular for, reasons. Like, take a look at this here Game & Watch. That sure is a game, but where is the Netflix app? Disney Plus? HBO? Not even YouTube? Yeah, that seems like false advertising to me. It's a good clock, though. Anyways, I believe that now is when my break time starts, so I'm just gonna play some Sonic Generations on my 3DS. Wait a minute. For as long as gaming consoles have existed, gaming companies, barring hardware makers, have always wanted to bring over their best experiences to as many devices as possible. Whether it be ports, remasters, remakes, collector's editions, or whatever else, many companies are always willing to find new places to put their games. There's probably a dozen ways to play the original Super Mario Bros. And at least 100 to play the first two Sonic games. I bet they'd put these things on a car if they could. I was joking! Okay, but what if I wanted to play this game on a system weaker than the one it was designed for? Well, nowadays, with graphics in games arguably stagnating, better optimization techniques, and a lower power gap between hardware, many games can be played on all of the major gaming systems, sometimes mobile phones, and even on the rare occasion stuff no one's heard about. Sounds like the name of a drugstore. But in the past, you'd be much less likely to have this amount of options, especially since the power difference between consoles and handhelds and even current gen and last gen was night and day. There was no way you could put this onto these. Or is there? So what do you do if you're a company wanting to cash in on the folks who still have last gen hardware, the millions of Wii owners, and the many, many handheld users? You lie! Yeah, for a time, especially between the 90s and 2010s, companies would just make multiple different games and just give them the same name and release them on the same day. Because that doesn't make things confusing! Licensed games were notorious for this, but sometimes a few of the larger developers would do this too. In fact, even some AAA companies took part in it. Though, as much as I'm glad that companies stopped doing this, there is a certain charm to these games that I wish we could bring back. Just give them a different name, though. So why don't we take a trip down memory lane and check out some of the games that share the same name as their counterparts on more powerful hardware, but were actually completely different games entirely? And who better to start with than LEGO? You can't talk about licensed games without mentioning LEGO, can you? They're the kings of this niche. With all the IPs they have under their belt and nearly 20 years of experience, over 25 if you count their original games, it's hard not to talk about them in a video like this. Ever since their first licensed game, LEGO Star Wars, and up to the release of the Nintendo Switch, LEGO had always made separate handheld versions of their games. Except the PSP, those were just the console version for some reason. Regardless, I don't have time to talk about every LEGO game that's existed, because if I did, I'd literally be here all week, so I'm just going to quickly go over the ones I found the most interesting. The first two LEGO Star Wars games got Game Boy Advance versions for some reason, and to say they're different from the console versions would be an understatement. Later LEGO games kept a similar gameplay formula to the console versions, but scaled back a bit and were given different layouts, and I'll talk about the early 3DS/PS Vita era games a bit later, but these were very different from the console versions, likely because the GBA wasn't even a 3D console like the GameCube, PS2, or OG Xbox. The GBA versions of these games played more like an isometric beat-em-up game rather than the action puzzle platformers the LEGO games are usually known for. Unfortunately, the compilation of those first two games, the complete Saga, never really made it to the GBA for some reason, but it did come to the DS and was yet again a different game. In fact, they even essentially made a DS version of the prequel trilogy, which didn't have a DS part back when it originally came out. Even though the DS version was already out. You know, you confuse me sometimes. From that point, they had created the perfect formula for the handheld versions of these games. Every LEGO game that came out after the complete Saga received a separate version specifically for the Nintendo DS, and then later the 3DS and PS Vita when those came out. Batman, Indiana Jones, The Hobbit, you name it, there was a LEGO game for it. The formula remained mostly the same throughout this time, but this all changed once 2013's LEGO Marvel Superheroes released. They were still making these for the DS? Starting with that game, the formula completely changed. back to the isometric beat-em-up formula that was on the GBA. It's sad too, because the games that came before this, such as Lego City Undercover, were starting to gain the open worlds that the console versions had for a few years at that point. It's like if you worked a minimum wage job at a fast food restaurant, found a better paying job at an office, worked there and got occasional promotions for years, and then decided to go back to the minimum wage job for a couple months. Oh yeah, did I forget to mention that this formula only lasted for like a year before they brought back the old formula, starting with Lego Batman 3? They even started bringing back the open world in later games. It was short-lived though, because only a few years later the Nintendo Switch release, basically ending the development of these kinds of games. At least it ended on a high-ish note though. If Lego are the kings of licensed games, then Nickelodeon are the royal shoe wearers. They've had a lot of experience with making games based off their own IPs, their most popular of which being, of course, SpongeBob SquarePants. They've also seen success making crossover games, whether it be crossover platformers with stories revolving around the worlds colliding, or just clones of literally every Mario spin-off that exists. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if we got a SpongeBob is Missing soon. Oh. Since Nickelodeon made these games to promote an existing brand, it's pretty obvious that they'd want to make handheld versions of these games to capture their vast market as well. I talk about all of them, but again, I don't want this video to be hours long, so I'll only go over the most popular ones. The first proper SpongeBob platformer, Super Sponge, was basically the same amongst the two consoles it was released on, the PlayStation and Game Boy Advance, with the main difference being graphics. This is probably because the game was a 2D platformer and therefore didn't need as much of a port between the two. However, practically every SpongeBob platformer after it did get a separate handheld version. For a while, the SpongeBob games on handhelds were basically just 2D platformers that had similar story beats to their 3D console counterparts. Revenge of the Flying Dutchman, Battle for Bikini Bottom, and the movie game were all 2D adaptations of 3D games you'd see on consoles. Lights, Camera, Pants was also a 2D platformer on the GBA, despite being a Mario Party clone on the consoles. It's like if they made Mario Tennis and RPG on the Game Boy Color. Wait, no, I'm not supposed to talk about that yet. Things changed when Creature from the Krusty Krab came out, and by that I mean the DS started being thrown into the mix. So yeah, there was this point in the mid-2000s where licensed game had not one, not two, but three, sometimes four separate versions. The console version, the DS version, the GBA version, and sometimes even a separate PC version. In SpongeBob's case, those games were Creature from the Krusty Krab, Atlantis SquarePantis, and Truth or Square. As usual though, the GBA versions were 2D platformers, minus Truth or Square, which never got a GBA release, but the DS games were all very different. Creature from the Krusty Krab was a different 2D platformer, while both Atlantis SquarePantis and Truth or Square were isometric 3D platformers. Oh, and the PC versions of like every SpongeBob game I mentioned here are point and clicks. The Nicktoons Unite games were a similar case as well, in which all their console versions were 3D platformers. The GBA games were all 2D platformers, minus Globs of Doom, which also didn't get a GBA release, and the DS versions just act like they're special. With Nicktoons Unite being a 3D platformer, Battle for Volcano Island being a 2D platformer, Attack of the Toybots being a beat-em-up, and Globs of Doom being a 2.5D puzzle platformer. I'd go about this in more detail, but this section is already coming close to being longer than my LEGO section, so I'll just speed on over to the next section. Get it? Because the next section is about Sonic. Sonic has had a pretty extensive history in the same name, different game, well, game. Starting as far back as the franchise's origins, pun not intended, they have made versions of Sonic games for weaker devices. With Sonic 1 and 2, there was a dedicated version for the Master System and Game Gear. Then they took a break from doing all of that until Sonic Unleashed, where they made a version for the PlayStation 2 and Wii, with all of the mainline Sonic games from that point until Lost World getting their own dedicated handheld versions for the DS and then the 3DS. Sonic Boom even got a dedicated 3DS version, 2 of them in fact. That's 2 times more than the amount the Wii U had. Even Sonic Forces technically got a version for weaker hardware, though that's just the mobile version, which I barely count purely because of the nature of mobile games. Many Sonic games got their own handheld versions, and when they weren't, it was usually because they were making original handheld games for the GBA and DS. Then there's Sonic Jam for the Gamecom, and don't even get me started on the Sonic 3 Tiger Electronics handheld. What's interesting is that Sonic takes a middle ground approach between LEGO's faithful adaptations and Nickelodeon's hog wild takes. What Sonic Team, or more accurately Dimps for the most part, are doing is making creative new takes on these games while still retaining the core gameplay that they're known for. Sonic 1 and 2 for Master System, Sonic Unleashed, and Lost World 3DS take the approach of stripping down the gameplay of their flagship counterparts and creating new levels designed around the limitations of the consoles they're put on. Whether it be the classic 2D gameplay of the Genesis titles, the more modern Boost style, or whatever Lost World was, these versions keep the core gameplay of their console counterparts, but only keeping the essential aspects of the games, or what could have realistically been done on the hardware they were given. On the other hand, there's Sonic Colors DS, Generations 3DS, and yes, even the Sonic Boom 3DS games. These four take wildly different approaches to their source material. Sonic Colors DS is basically an adaptation of the game's story beats, but with elements and gameplay from the Sonic Rush series of games, which were the previous Sonic games on the system, might I add, tacked onto it. Many fans call this one the unofficial Sonic Rush 3, and for good reason too. It is basically the same gameplay style, only in the locales of Sonic Colors. Generations 3DS also has a completely different take on the source material, with classic Sonic generally staying the same, but with modern Sonic being changed into a more Sonic Rush-styled gameplay experience as well. And the locales are almost all different, with some of them even tackling the franchise's handheld history, though I do wish it went a bit further than just the Rush games. Imagine if they included levels from Sonic Advance or the Game Gear games. Finally, there's the two 3DS Sonic Boom games. Now, technically, these are labeled as separate things to the Wii U's Rise of Lyric, but I thought I'd bring them up anyways since they're all under the Sonic Boom brand. Sonic Boom, Shattered Crystal, and Sonic Boom Fire and Ice are both 2D platformers with a focus on exploration, almost akin to a Metroidvania. Unlike their Wii U counterpart, these games are actually polished and run well, and I hear they're even kind of fun? Such a novel concept, I know. Honestly, I feel kind of bad for Sonic Boom because everything that was released under the brand except for the flagship Wii U game, which wasn't even meant for that console by the way, was actually pretty good. The TV show is probably one of the funniest shows I've ever seen, and I genuinely believe the 3DS games should have been the flagship titles, especially since the Wii U sold horribly. I'd go on a tangent about how Sonic Boom was done super dirty, but I'd be here all day and this section's already getting pretty long. Why don't we just rapid fire through the last few things I want to talk about before we wrap this up, alright? There are a couple more notable IPs that have made use of this tactic, so I'm just going to skim through those real quick. Pac-Man World 2 on GBA was actually a completely different game to its console counterpart, which is weird to me because the GBA version of the original Pac-Man World, as well as the DS version of Pac-Man World 3, are just downscaled ports of the originals. Pac-Man World 2 on GBA is basically an isometric 3D platformer in the style of the first game. Practically every Rayman game before Origins also got a separate handheld version, and they're all 2D platformers in some way, minus Raving Rabbids 2, which was a party game similar to its Wii counterpart. My favorite looking one is probably Raving Rabbids DS. I'm a massive fan of the 2.5D art style that some platformers try to do, and it looks kinda cool, especially running on a DS of all things. Both Crash of the Titans and Crash Mind Over Mutant got handheld versions, with the GBA version of Crash of the Titans and the DS version of Mind Over Mutant being a different 3D platformer to its console counterparts. Spyro also had a similar thing happen with the Legend of Spyro trilogy, where the GBA and DS versions are all 2D platformers based off their 3D console counterparts. I'm not too interested in the Spyro series, so I don't really have much to say here. Did you know that even Nintendo has done this tactic? Blasphemy, I know! The games lucky enough to receive this treatment were the original Mario Tennis and Golf games. They were released on both the Nintendo 64 and Game Boy Color, and the coolest thing about the Game Boy Color versions of these games is the story mode. It almost feels like an RPG of sorts, where the battles are replaced by sports matches. They tried bringing this back with the Switch Mario sports games, which I find neat, though I hear it's nowhere near as good as the originals. Oh well. And I think that clears the list. I would have talked about a few more licensed games, but honestly, that would have taken even more time, and I'm already very exhausted from writing the script. What's crazy is that this practice was so common for so long that people barely ever stopped and looked at why this kind of thing is honestly kind of misleading for people buying these games, as well as making them more confusing to discuss online since you have to specify which version you're talking about. I feel like even doing as little as changing the title of the game would do so much to differentiate them while keeping the honestly pretty cool idea of having multiple different takes on the same idea released at the same time, making use of each console's strengths and weaknesses to provide something tailor-made for your system of choice. It's a cool and fascinating idea buried under such a lame practice. And it's a shame that the lesser versions of these games didn't get nearly as much recognition until recently, though it's great that this once popular medium is still remembered and discussed by many, especially now that we have the gift of hindsight, given that this practice has become obsolete with the advent of handhelds such as this, and this. It'd be neat to see the idea of multiple takes on the same game pop up again someday, obviously without the misleading nature of it, but for now, I think I'll be happy being able to play the same game no matter what system I pick. Yeah, I got bored. As it turns out, there's a lot of false advertising and misinformation out there, so much so that the government decided to step in and do my job for me, decades before I even thought of starting my own organization. Well, that was a bust, and I'm still bored. Maybe some Sonic Boom on the 3DS will help cheer me up. God damn it!